Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Katerina. I am a policy officer for Siena, and I will be your host for today. I would like to first and foremost welcome to the fourth and final webinar from our EBFM series From Paradigm to Practice. Before I introduce today's guest, and in case this is your first time attending a Siena webinar, I would just like to give you a quick and gentle reminder to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to pose your questions to our speaker during this presentation. And these questions will be answered during the Q&A session shortly after the presentation is done. Please make sure that your username is clear, and if needed, introduce yourselves at the beginning of your questions. And just to remind everyone that this session is being recorded, and all recordings from the 4 webinars of this series will be circulated to the participants in the next couple of weeks. We've heard from many scientists throughout this series on a need for the decision makers to have an active role on implementing EBFM, and today's guest is going to speak exactly on how to support them. So I would like to welcome Daniel Steadman to the stage, this virtual stage. Daniel is an officer in Pew's International Fisheries team and will present a checklist for requesting ecosystem-based scientific fisheries advice. This tool intends to support fisheries managers in moving beyond narrow science advice requests that solely and traditionally focus on maximizing yield and towards broader requests to provide the basis for EBFM implementation. Then welcome, and you're free to share your screen and start your presentation.
Very much, Katerina, and thank you to Siena for the invitation to this fourth and final webinar in their ecosystem-based fisheries management series. So my name is Dan Steadman from the Pew Charitable Trusts. I won't give you a full institutional rundown, but we are an international NGO and I'm part of their international fisheries team. And that team focuses on improving fisheries management in international settings across the world. So we're active in most of the world's RFMOs, certainly all of the tuna RFMOs, and also across lots of different forms of multilateral fishery, including several across the Northeast Atlantic. I am not a scientist, and Pew is not a scientific body. We're an advocacy organization. So as Katerina pointed out, while you've heard a lot about the kind of incremental improvements in science that have happened to support EBFM, what we're more focusing on is the sort of the politics of EBFM, the governance of introducing EBFM and trying to overcome some of these political and management barriers that we've heard about from a lot of the other speakers over this series. So my presentation is called Requesting Ecosystem-Based Advice, How Better Questions Lead to More Ambitious Policy. And in it, I will be presenting a checklist to help fisheries managers or environmental managers more broadly request scientific advice. Oh, my screen's not moving on. There we go. So just a bit of background to the checklist that I'll be presenting. So Pew regularly produces issue briefs on particular topics associated with its campaigns. These briefs are kind of short form, concise readouts, particularly on technical topics, and particularly where there's a need for translating complex science or complex concepts for more of a, not a complete lay audience, but certainly for a policymaker audience and other kind of interested stakeholders around a particular issue. And the brief that I'm going to talk to you about today is actually called To Improve Fisheries Management and Protect Ecosystems, Decision Makers Must Ask Better Questions. And it's the third in a series of Pew issue briefs that are focused on ecosystem-based fisheries management. The first was a kind of situation analysis of the case for EBFM in the Northeast Atlantic, which I should say is the primary region where Pew is focusing on EBFM, but it has worked on this topic in North America in the past, and we're increasingly looking at it as an issue across other international fisheries settings. The second in that toolkit series was about another fisheries tool that Pew advocates strongly for, which is the use of harvest strategies or long-term management strategies, as they're called in this part of the world, and using them as a vehicle for introducing ecosystem-based fisheries management. So this brief that I'll talk to you about is the third in that series. We feel that improving science advice processes is key to progress in all international fisheries contexts, and not necessarily solely through the lens of implementing EBFM, but also in introducing long-term management strategies and in kind of other science policy improvements that would ladder down to improvements in fisheries themselves. And through the campaign that we've been running on implementing EBFM, specifically in the Northeast Atlantic, which has now been running for a couple of years, we've really identified that request formulation is this really key critical moment in fisheries policy setting, where new advice can really provide the groundwork for potentially new directions in policy, and it's therefore a kind of a critical moment for decision makers to kind of maximize opportunities, and also to be kind of inclusive and transparent in how they go about that process. But why specifically a checklist for advice requesters? Why did we think this particular topic merited an issue brief and this specific checklist tool? None of these are necessarily sort of solely applicable reasons why fisheries managers in particular. You could really think about this as questions that any government department that's managing an environmental resource, or even any industry that's harvesting from or using things from the natural world, they are working in an uncertain system. They're working in things where kind of cause and effect is quite hard to predict, and they therefore need scientific advice. They need to look forward. They need advisors to answer questions for them within reasonable bounds of certainty. And so obviously the tradition of asking scientists for advice in fisheries management is now very well established, more in some places than others. And it's a kind of integral part of how fisheries decision making works. But I think it's fair to say in the Northeast Atlantic and probably at large in the fisheries sector that those questions that the decision makers have posed to their scientists have tended to focus on quite limited objectives with quite narrow scope. That's I guess more by design than by accident. They have typically been asking these questions under policy frameworks that have specifically narrow objectives, particularly yield maximization. So in a way, it's the kind of changing policy landscape that has opened up a window for scientific advice processes to be bigger and more ambitious. But it's, I guess, our working assumption that the foundations for ambitious management are only possible with ambitious questions. And just talking about new obligations and new policy frameworks, one of the reasons that we think this is really important is that fisheries managers are not anymore just governed by fisheries related agreements. The UN Fish Stocks Agreement, for example, as a kind of global instrument that provides a basis for how lots of fisheries decision making is conducted, that talks about ecosystems and it talks about questions beyond just sustainability and yield maximization, but there's a whole host of new environmental obligations that apply at global level and then that ladder down to regional and national level, that really fisheries managers or any government department that is sort of focused on or as a user or manager of biodiversity need to be thinking about. So I'm thinking about the Kunmin Global Biodiversity Framework. It's the Conference of Parties for that happening right now. And I'm also thinking about the forthcoming Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Treaty. These present a much bigger tableau of responsibilities for fisheries managers. And that really underscores the need for these better questions, these bigger, broader questions. So what you can see on the left there is a figure that is within this issue brief that is our kind of condensed version of a checklist that we believe that fisheries managers and environmental managers that focus on the marine environment should be thinking about when they are drafting scientific advice request. And the checklist aims to guide managers through the request process through 3 stages: preparation, initiation, and formulation. And I'll just unpack each of those in a little bit of detail in the following slides. I won't go through every single action under every single stage because that might be too time consuming. but I'm happy to answer questions if there are things that people have seen in the brief that they would like more explanation of, or that they see in this figure that I don't cover. So stage one, preparation, designing the request process. So this is really the point before any words have been committed to paper, before a really clear vision of what the manager wants to achieve, or the managers want to achieve, has really been established. And this is really about how the request will be conducted, who will be involved, how it will be administered and recorded and documented. And these are fairly basic principles that would apply to most forms of kind of policy process or consultation. So those key actions are a lead forum, so identifying an existing or creating a new body to oversee the process. So in the context of an RFMO, for example, this might well be a science manager dialogue group, so a pre-existing forum where scientists and managers are already kind of debating and having kind of transactions around how to produce advice and advice requests. Open documentation, so developing a transparent system for recording and sharing the process and the relevant documentation as it evolves. Multilateral liaison, so this is particularly relevant obviously for multilateral requests or requests that focus on, in the case of fisheries, shared fish stocks. And this is the importance of kind of not having one party in a multilateral setting kind of take too much of the impetus, and for this process to be designed so that it can kind of interact with the way that all parties in a shared setting might well need to operate, and their own kind of domestic obligations to consultation and due process. And then finally, stakeholder inclusion, so designing a process to include iterative appropriate stakeholder input. This is something that I'll come back to in a little bit of detail when we look at some examples later. But I think it's something that certainly in the Northeast Atlantic seems to be gathering pace as an idea. The idea that request formulation is an opportunity for stakeholders, whether they be industry, NGOs, or other non-state actors, to kind of feed into this question of what the scope of a given request is, and how it will be delivered. So in terms of the breakdown of key actions, we also in the brief just explain why we think each step is necessary. I should say as well, I should have said this at the outset, but this is not presented as some kind of unalterable, thou shalt follow these steps in this order type checklist. In practice, some of these things would happen alongside one another, or they would come in a different order, etc. But it's just presented as a kind of hypothetical set of steps. So stakeholder inclusion, we know now from countless bodies of literature that diverse perspectives and knowledge types improve the credibility and legitimacy of scientific process. We've known that for a long time, but that isn't always reflected in how scientific advice is conceived or delivered. So that's absolutely vital. We also stress that inclusion shouldn't be limited just to the request formulation stage. There should also be opportunities for input to kind of request delivery and request implementation ultimately. Multilateral liaison, I already explained a bit about that. This is especially necessary in ocean regions with a kind of patchwork of governance, where you might have overlapping bilateral, multilateral, in the case of ocean decision making, high seas and domestic obligations and different frameworks. And it's really a chance to kind of start aligning policy priorities and working out whether there is a kind of sweet spot between all the different environmental and fisheries obligations of the different parties that this request could potentially help to improve or to satisfy. So stage 2 is initiation. So this is defining the actual scope of the request, deciding what elements it will focus on. So not necessarily kind of drafting the details, but deciding how broad to paint the picture. There's only 2 actions that we've associated with this stage. So the first is international and national obligations. So I said at the start that the the range of obligations that a fisheries manager is now kind of theoretically or practically subject to, depending on the level at which they operate, has increased. And there are various different obligations that parties might want to bring to the table, both from their own backyard or from the kind of international UN sphere. And at this initiation stage, kind of before diving into the detail about real specifics of what is going to be tested and what is going to be evaluated or assessed or reviewed, requesters, whether individually or in a group, should be looking at all the relevant treaties, laws, and frameworks that might well be applicable to this request, and at the very least screening for whether they are relevant to what they want to achieve. This stage is also the chance to define the focal element. So this is literally defining what the request should examine. And this seems like a quite prosaic step in a way, but we've certainly seen evidence even in recent years of kind of missed opportunities to think about not just the target species, but also its interaction with other exploited species, its role in food webs, and its kind of trophic interactions with other species it shares ecosystems with, and even the kind of compounding effect of interacting fisheries that are in the same space or where there are kind of bycatch interactions between the two. So this again is really just about kind of pulling out what and which things you want to focus on, and making sure you're not kind of too constrained. So just to break those down in a bit more detail, those international and national obligations, they could consider conservation law, they could consider sustainable use law. In the context of UN agreements, they could look at fisheries related agreements, they could look at biodiversity related agreements, they could even look at climate related agreements. And that's obviously increasingly something that we know requesters, we know fisheries management bodies are increasingly interested in. And they should consider all global treaties and multilateral frameworks as kind of in play at this stage, before at least discarding them when they become more specific in their request. By defining those focal elements, the specificity enables research focus and avoids managerial misinterpretation. And what I mean there is that the more specific that a manager can be at the outset about what specific interactions or what specific components of the ecosystem they are interested in looking at, the less that advice can be extrapolated to sort of assume to apply equally to all parts of an ecosystem. And then the final stage is formulation. So this is actually kind of putting pen to paper, drafting the terms of reference, kind of putting shape around the request. And there's some really important things in here, which, I think we haven't necessarily seen that much evidence of in some of the recent requests that we have reviewed, but I'll go on to talk about, hopefully, there's maybe a sign of the times that things might be changing with the evidence of some more recently submitted requests. So the three key actions under the formulation stage are objective setting, so defining the policy aims or scenarios to be tested and modeled. Objective measurement, so outlining testable and acceptable indicators and thresholds. So rather than simply limiting yourself to a set of objectives, you actually try to come up with some metrics by which you want those objectives to be tested, and potentially even thresholds at which point you think an objective can be defined as achieved or not achieved, or a limit crossed, or so to try and put some specificity on what these scenarios are that you want to look at in more detail. And then finally, and this, we haven't really seen much evidence of this really in any of the requests that we reviewed, both in preparing this brief or since running the campaign, and that's some form of implementation plan. So something that outlines how advice will actually be used, including how or whether it will trigger a management action. And I think that's really important from the sense of accountability, but I think it's also important in the sense of kind of advice requesting being something that becomes more efficient and iterative and purposeful. I guess the kind of the opposite of what the title of this brief is that, you know, vague questions will lead to vague advice. So if from the outset the question is not kind of parsed in a way or explained in a way that will lead to, you know, where there's a very clear kind of golden thread through to a potential management action at the end, then, you know, that kind of represents in advice environments where we know that scientific advisors are already kind of strapped for time. In the fisheries world and in the Northeast Atlantic, there are a whole host of stocks where there's an obligation to provide, you know, annual fishing opportunity advice. We really need to kind of maximize the bang for buck that we get from, you know, non-recurring requests from these sort of, as we would call them, special requests in this part of the world. And putting in place some kind of implementation plan where you say, you know, subject to the findings of this request, we will do X, Y, or Z, to us is a very necessary step for ensuring that that kind of science advice process becomes more meaningful and more ambitious. So in terms of these objectives, where they come from, so they might derive from existing policies or frameworks, or they might be entirely created anew. So we've seen, for example, requests that have looked at sort of elements of objectives within different policy frameworks and whether they can be reconciled. For example, objectives in the common fisheries policy around maximizing sustainable yield, and then objectives in the Marine Strategy Framework Directive to do with achieving various different indicators of healthy fish populations. They might be newly created. This is particularly relevant for thinking about management strategy evaluations and harvest strategies, where the whole kind of purpose of the evaluation in a way is to introduce and test you know, quite granular objectives and work out what the different outcomes of sort of prioritizing or deprioritizing particular objectives might be. So objective setting could involve saying, I'm a policymaker and I'm subject to these different objectives across these different policy frameworks, or it could be a more sort of fishery specific circumstance where you say, okay, I need to balance predator needs with the desire of the industry to have year-on-year catch stability, and what different scenarios might well, you know, optimally achieve both of those things, with trade-offs between them kind of minimized. And objective setting in the context of ecosystem-based fisheries management, there are kind of Hillborn and other papers that go back almost 2 decades now, saying that setting consensus-based objectives is a key precursor to achieving EBFM, and that in a way that the lack of that step being fulfilled in many EBFM related processes has ended up with the situation that we're in, that we heard from Jacob and others, with this kind of off repeated situation where it, you know, EBFM processes are seen to be kind of you know, not purposeful and quite staid and subject to lots of management barriers. On implementation, I've already talked through this. So obviously those management actions will only be defined really clearly after the request has been delivered, but thinking about this to an extent in advance and you know, working out how something will actually lead to a management action, we see as absolutely key. And we think it's key, and I should have said this earlier, it's key to gaining stakeholder support and enabling transparency. So you know, I think we said at the outset of this checklist that stakeholder inclusion is absolutely key, but I think if stakeholders are kind of kept in the loop along the way, particularly when, you know, the request has been initiated and the scope has been defined of what the potential consequences might be, you know, of this advice being released and then followed, then the more likely there will be to kind of gain credibility and legitimacy in the eyes of the stakeholders. So having laid out those theoretical steps for a checklist to guide scientific advice requesting, we then looked at a few examples of relatively recent scientific advice requests prepared by fisheries managers. We looked in the Northeast Atlantic, but we also looked a bit beyond. And we included a kind of fairly simple traffic light system to evaluate the extent to which specific requests aligned with the steps that we had examined. So this was the 5 requests that we looked at in the brief. Some of them are starting to already feel a bit old, which is a bit crazy because we only released this brief last year. But I'm sure given the audience here, some or other of these will be quite familiar to you. So we looked at one sort of unilateral request by just one single fishing party. So this was a series of requests by the European Union looking at interactions between demersal fisheries and seafloor integrity, and kind of exploring the trade-offs between that kind of biodiversity outcome and between the need for sustainable demersal fisheries. We looked at 2 multilateral examples. So we looked at a trilateral request submitted by the European Union, United Kingdom, and Norway regarding the drafting of a long-term management plan for North Sea autumn spawning herring. That was 2 years ago now in 2022, but that process is actually going on now. And then we looked at a collaboration between 2 multilateral bodies, so the Northeast Atlantic Fisheries Commission and the OSPAR Convention Commission in 2020, who submitted a request regarding the status and distribution of deep water elasmobranchs. We then wanted to throw the canvas a bit wider, and we looked at 2 regional fisheries management organization science advice requests outside the Northeast Atlantic. So we looked at the West Central Pacific Fisheries Commission request regarding multi-species management for tropical tunas. And then we also looked at the Northwest Atlantic Fishery Organization's series of requests regarding a roadmap for the ecosystem approach to fisheries. Now, I know this series wasn't specifically badged as focusing on the Northeast Atlantic, but I know it's probably a slight bias of our network that that is the most likely webinar attendees that we're going to attract. So I haven't pulled out all 5 of those examples into this slide. I've purely looked at the 3 that are relevant to the Northeast Atlantic. Oh, no, actually, no, sorry, that's not true. I've looked at 2 that are relevant to the Northeast Atlantic, and then I've looked at 1 that is very specifically focused on the ecosystem approach to fisheries management. So that's the Northwest Atlantic Fisheries Organization's roadmap. And you can see here, like I said, very simple traffic light system. So green indicates that we assess the step to have been completed. Amber is that the step's been partly completed, and the red indicates the step's not included. In some cases, we put a gray where this step is just simply was never going to be relevant to the scope of the request. So yeah, there are a few gray checks in there too. So you can see in terms of sort of, I should say as well, this is not some sort of very sophisticated peer-reviewed system. This is a very sort of subjective analysis that we did relatively quickly, simply to support the idea that you know, this checklist could be a useful decision support tool for managers wanting to quickly assess whether they had taken full advantage of the opportunity of a given science advice request. So overall, the one where I think you can see the most, well, no, actually, both the EU's unilateral request and the NAFO roadmap series of requests both have quite a few green ticks. So, for example, in the EU demersal fisheries kind of habitat integrity trade-off, there was a very deliberate process of stakeholder inclusion. There were a series of workshops. There were workshops when the request was being developed, but there were also workshops when the request was being delivered and when before even the advice had produced its final scenarios. So you had at that point a manager saying at the outset, right, we really want to design this in a way that includes stakeholders, because we know inherently in this request there's going to be trade-offs between things that different groups will value differently. You also had quite a clear focus on objective setting. The original terms of reference includes references to exactly what I said at the start, the EU's common fisheries policy, and MSY, and then their obligations to do with maintaining and restoring seafloor integrity, which come through the Marine Strategy Framework Directive and other related things like the OSPAR Convention. The NAFO roadmap for the ecosystem approach to fisheries management, again, paints a very broad canvas from the start. It was very much about looking at the entire functioning of that RFMO and trying to work out how you would redesign that to incorporate ecosystem-based advice and ecosystem-based decision-making. So it was very mindful of these sort of broad international and national obligations. They even kind of rewrote their own convention to be more in line with the requirements of various EBFM obligations in UN treaties. Stakeholder inclusion is the only one that we kind of half rated there, because a lot of the work on these requests was done very much within the confines of a scientific committee. And once elements of it were delivered to managers, there were some concerns that there hadn't been enough kind of stakeholder involvement, and there wasn't a clear enough understanding of how particular things had been done. But that's a relatively minor criticism. The one where there are more concerns is the trilateral North Sea herring long-term management plan request, where there wasn't a particularly open documentation. This was done through a trilateral format that involves fairly minimal observer access, so that it also gets a bad mark for stakeholder inclusion. It looked very narrowly at the target species when, we know that herring plays an important ecosystem role in the North Sea, and we know that there's also concerns about interaction with other herring stocks and impacts on particularly depleted Western Baltic populations. So this one we saw as quite a missed opportunity to paint a much broader canvas and set in place a management strategy evaluation that could have looked a lot more broadly at different objectives and been linked to different obligations. So I wanted to flag these as well. These are two requests that were kind of conceived during the year where this advice checklist was released, and to my mind, they are in a sense a sign of some progress, in that they are both very much couched around the ecosystem approach. The first is the EU-UK request on forage fish that they developed through their specialised committee on fisheries. So the kind of framework post-Brexit that the two parties are using to try and normalise their kind of fisheries relationship. And that specifically looks at well beyond the target species that are in focus, and looks at predator-prey interactions. It names very specific species groups that it applies to. There isn't really a defined objective, so the objective is only really kind of information gathering, so there's not really a line of sight to how the request will be used, but we certainly saw it as a very welcome step, in the sense of being a non-typical request and trying to paint that broader canvas. You've then got a very live, well, it's very live in the sense that the advice that has come from this request has only just been delivered, but there was a request for given higher level biodiversity and ecosystem objectives, describe available approaches to define related operational objectives. So this is a kind of ecosystem approach to fisheries management request, specifically tabled by the parties of the North East Atlantic Fisheries Commission. There are objectives that are pointed to here, but they are kind of drawn directly from the convention text, and the advice that has resulted from this request kind of says, right, we've looked at some of the nuts and bolts of how you could implement EBFM, but it's over to you now really to kind of define the objectives and what you actually want to achieve under this framework. And I would give it a sort of partial mark for stakeholder involvement, in the sense that this request was discussed within a scientific committee meeting where at least partial observer access is possible. So it's not like these two sort of would smash it out the park if we rated them against every single element in our checklist, but they are signs potentially of decision makers trying to use scientific advice processes to think a little bit beyond the question of how much can I catch next year, and how do I maximize fishing opportunities without crashing stocks. So we see them as generally positive signs of progress So next steps. So this tool has been out there now for about a year or so, advocating for better requests, bigger questions, painting a broader canvas from the start will be key to Pew's work on ecosystem-based fisheries management going forward, whether that be in the Northeast Atlantic or beyond. We really do think, as I said at the outset, that this is a kind of critical juncture where you can signal a very clear change in political direction, and where you can kind of satisfy those multiple obligations you have across different policy frameworks. We'll continue to assess future requests and request development processes against the checklist. So we plan to use it quite proactively, not just for past examples, but also to kind of benchmark requests that are that are live now. We'll also continue to participate in efforts in the Northeast Atlantic to improve stakeholder participation in request formulation and advice processes. And I know lots of people on this call who are representatives of the Secretariats of Advisory Councils will be quite familiar with this and know that it's something that the European Union in particular is very interested in, and wants to try to hopefully formalize in some way, which is something we're very supportive of. And we've also got a new issue brief in development, which working title, this is not finalized yet, but is called How Ecological Objectives Can Turn Ecosystem-Based Policy into Fisheries Practice. And this really gets into that thorny issue of objective setting that I pointed out several times throughout the checklist. What is an ecological objective? How should it be worded? What indicators should it have? How should we, evaluate its effectiveness? Those are questions that we're trying to answer in our next issue brief. And that's about all from me. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Daniel, for your presentation. It is very interesting always to hear about this work with the decision makers. We will now start the Q&A session. And before we tackle our participants' questions, and once again, I invite everyone to ask your questions in the Q&A box. The Q&A session is open, so please, 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 please feel free to ask your questions in the Q&A box. I would just like to kick this session off with a question to you. Please bear with me. I have had this question on the back of my mind all throughout this series, and I'll try my best to formulate it. So we heard a lot in the past 2 weeks during these series about the importance of words, how there is such thing as right and better questions, and that communication plays a key role in bridging this gap between science and this very seemingly complex concept of EBFM, and decision makers who are more often than not that compelled by all this scientific jargon. And so we've had 3 scientists joining us during this series who have stepped into this role of communicators and acknowledge how important it is to effectively communicate in an accessible way the outcomes of their research. So I would like to kind of challenge you then to coming from an NGO and who a lot of times has this role of breaking down information into a more digestible format. I would like to ask you, for our non-technical attendees, although I acknowledge that we do have quite a lot of scientists and experts joining us today, but for our non-EBFM savvy folk, how would you explain to them the importance of EBFM and what is at stake if we don't move away from this single species silo mindset? I know it's a trick question, but
Katerina, that's very cruel, and I feel you should have given me advance warning. Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and I often think about it. I mean, you're often challenged in the communications space, and you will know this, Katerina, to say, if you can't explain it to your elderly grandparents, then how do you expect to explain it to anyone else? That's the kind of challenge you have to put yourself through. The way that I like to think about it is that for a very long time, basically since we decided to have rules around fishing, we've tried to manage them like little kind of species in a box. Like we've kind of transposed a lot of thinking from farming and from agriculture about production, and that you can kind of control all these values, and that has taken for granted the fact that fisheries is of probably all the resource production sectors in the world, the one that is most dependent on marine ecosystems. It's most dependent. We are literally taking wild species out of their ecosystems and kind of using them for our own purposes. So for me, EBFM is trying to kind of take us out of a sort of a post-war way of thinking of we just need to kind of maximize food and we need to maximize yield, and we can treat each fish stock like it is a kind of self-contained production unit, and actually trying to kind of open up to systems thinking, systems decision making, to say, okay, if we take this out of the system, there clearly are knock-on effects. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't take things out of the system, but it means we should be prepared for those effects. And we should have kind of precautionary safeguards in place for what the worst consequences of that could be. So yeah, to my mind, I think if the advocacy community, the fishing industry community, and the scientific community, if they're all aligned around the idea that EBFM is not happening kind of quickly or deeply or well enough, I think they need to convey that idea more, that it's sort of getting away from very old ways of thinking that are very much baked into what scientists expect to hear from their advisors, what managers expect to get done in an annual negotiation, and they literally baked into all of the kind of frameworks and structures that they use to organize those negotiations. Finding space in an annual negotiation to talk about things like predator prey effects, or to think about what's the long term horizon for this species under different climate scenarios, that's almost impossible at the moment. You have to basically, reflect that the whole system has been set up for this purpose, and we need to kind of tweak elements of that system before we can actually convince ourselves that we're, embedding environmental considerations into fisheries management. I don't know if that was clear enough. I'm
No,
not sure
no,
my
that was a great
not
answer.
sure my grandmother would understand that, but maybe it's a start.
No, I think it was a very good answer concerning that it is a big and complex subject to explain. And I'm happy that you brought up the topic of the pace that this changing is happening. And you talked a lot about a changing political landscape and how this change can be the driving force behind how these questions are formulated and asked by these fisheries managers. So my question to you would be, do you feel that particularly for EBFM, the landscape is changing fast, or is this landscape not changing fast enough to address the issues that we're now facing?
I guess it depends whether you're a kind of an optimist or a pessimist. So the pessimist view would be that there have been decades worth of commitments to the ecosystem approach. They go back arguably to the early 90s and the Rio Earth Summit, and then lots of kind of subsequent iterations of what exactly that means and how it applies generally and how it applies to particular sectors. And if we reflect on them as a whole, there are clearly a few jurisdictions around the world, particularly domestically, where some states have really moved from single sector approaches to ecosystem approaches. In North America, for example, I would say it's that's a fairly well established part of US fisheries management. In Australia as well, I would say. But overall, the picture is one of almost kind of 35 years of not inaction, but a lot of theory and not enough practice. On the other hand, I would say that the fact that the ecosystem approach is still woven into, the most current sort of environmental obligations, like the Global Biodiversity Framework, like the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Treaty, and it kind of remains there as alongside the precautionary approach as this sort of central tenet of what fisheries managers should be doing and what their obligations are. I think that's provides kind of renewed impetus for revisiting these things. I think there's been something that I've noticed as a theme throughout the 3 webinars has been an urgency of conveying the idea of doing things incrementally, and not getting hung up on, we need to model and understand and simulate and be able to respond to every single possible environmental interaction, or every single sort of ecological social relationship, but that there are interactions, there are kind of interdependencies that are well quantified and well understood enough for managers to kind of introduce precautionary measures in response to them. So that message seems to me to be being heard now, and I think you now have requesters that are not thinking in terms of, and I really liked Jacob's diagram yesterday of the sort of like, I think previously there'd been assumption that you'd have this one mechanism, this one like EBM law or framework or something like that, and then you'd just get there. But clearly the message is now getting through that mechanisms are important, but so is stakeholder process, so is kind of scientific reform, etc. Like that, it's a kind of ladder of different responsibilities, rather than a kind of one-stop shop. We'll do some EBFM, and then in 5 years' time, everything will be sorted.
Yeah, I was going to ask you precisely about if you had any thoughts on the other presentations, because I know you attended all the other webinars. And do you feel that the barrier that this implementation is facing now is it because decision makers have this sense of, if we don't know everything about EBFM, we can't go forward? Because I liked the approach that Jacob had with, we don't need to do everything all at once everywhere, and that there are enough examples by now
Yeah,
of things
absolutely.
that you
Yeah.
can do. And I know that this is a very broad concept, but at the same time, in specific areas there's a lot of good examples. And do you feel that's the main challenge now? It's to overcome that misconstruct idea that if you don't know everything about the environment or that specific habitat,
Mm.
you cannot even start implementing EBFM.
I think it's a factor. I think it's maybe getting into the realms of a convenient excuse rather than a genuine barrier. I would say the more genuine barrier is the sort of path dependency of how fisheries decisions are currently made. And part of the point of a request checklist was to say that the science advice process is clearly a very important part of fisheries decision making, and with some tweaks, it could be made to be more expansive. But it's only with that kind of slight inward look at like how are we actually set up. If you look at things like the FAO's ecosystem approach implementation tool, the very first category of things that decision makers should be thinking about is ability to achieve. And ability to achieve is about governance. It's about saying, do the systems that you have in place allow you to be thinking about trade-offs? Do they allow you to kind of, if it's decided through consensus, to kind of prioritize one part of a socio-ecological system over another? And if they don't allow you to do that, then there's not really any point in investing in what your ecological or social objectives would be. If you haven't really looked at like the actual structure of how you make decisions, then you're not going to get anywhere. And that is what has felt at times in this campaign like the frustration, is that whilst you have lots of frameworks that lots of fishing nations are subject to and that they kind of continue to pay lip service to, if you actually attend a fisheries negotiation and you listen to the constraints on those negotiations, it just doesn't feel like there's time, there's sort of enough political capital in thinking about wider parts of the ecosystem, because there's so much pressure within a given year just to satisfy the demands of a kind of single species system. So I'd say that's the bigger challenge, really, is that there is a degree of reform, I think, that has to come with implementing EBFM. And nobody likes reform, and it takes a long time. And in a multilateral setting, it requires reform that each party can live with, right? So I think those are more the challenge. I think it's a structural challenge rather than purely an issue with getting too focused on big picture versus more manageable size of task.
Yeah, definitely. Change is scary, but it's a good thing as well. So we're happy to see this change happening little by little. We have a couple of questions in our chat. So first question comes from Ellen Wade, and Ellen asks, within this checklist approach, where and what are the opportunities for stakeholders, for example, industry and NGOs, to help shape the requests more effectively? And at what stages in the process can that influence occur?
So we put it very deliberately right at the outset, and we also tried to make clear that it shouldn't be limited to the outset. This has been a quite interesting part of our campaign in the sense that there has been some unwillingness to talk about this on both the science and management side, because there has been this idea of sort of a protected space between fisheries managers and scientists to kind of hash out some of those details, and that the additional involvement of stakeholders would kind of complicate that process. The way we've responded to that is to say that we kind of respect that need, but that managers and all the managers in the Northeast Atlantic, for example, are signatories to the Aarhus Convention, which is all to do with transparency and environmental decision making. They all have it very much within their remit to set up a process before they've even gone to their science advisors to say, we want to investigate X and Y, and we would like your initial input in these questions. I think we have started to see some kind of green shoots. I couldn't point to a really, really good example of, well, probably actually that EU one that I mentioned in the review is probably the best example, because it was designed like that from the start. I guess if I was being, I think it was probably designed that way because people knew it's a contentious topic, and they knew that the idea of entering into trade-off discussions between demersal fisheries productivity and seabed integrity were kind of inherently setting up a kind of opposition within stakeholder groups that would make the request process quite difficult. So they thought, let's get ahead of that and let's actually plan opportunities for input. So that's probably the best example. But yeah, I mean, for us, it's a fairly key campaign ask that in their absence, that managers spend some time thinking about stakeholder inclusion in request formulation. And like I said, we're very supportive of the work that the advisory councils are doing on trying to push for that to become more normalized within the European Union at least, and hopefully other Northeast Atlantic fishing parties will kind of take note of that approach.
Thank you. Well, I have a question from Jenny Grossman. Jenny, please bear with me. I'm not an English native speaker, so I'll try my best to convey your message, but it's perfectly fine to be this big. So do you have any recommendations on how the precautionary approach could best come into the design of requests for ecosystem-based scientific advice, reflecting uncertainty and knowledge gaps, like around ecosystem dynamics and impacts? For example, in situations where it is not yet possible to provide fully fledged ecosystem-based advice that quantifies and accounts for all relevant factors, there is a risk that decision makers just default back to business as usual based on single stock advice, for example. Are there recommended ways of designing requests so that they at least aim to minimize risks to fish populations and ecosystems, so that the responses to the requests would at least constitute an improvement compared to the single stock status quo way of managing fisheries, even if they cannot fully answer all questions?
And she also adds, sorry, that turned into a giant question.
Perfectly okay.
Yeah, great question. I mean, so another fairly common thread, at least through Jacob and Jessica's presentations in this series, was management strategy evaluations. And I have flagged them, but I think I flagged them briefly in this, and they are referred to in the brief as well. I think that's a really good opportunity to not kind of reinvent the entire wheel and have to like change all your reference points and change all your decision-making processes in pursuit of being more ecosystem based, and instead to look at, right, okay, for this fishery or this group of fisheries, what are the different scenarios that we could use to try to achieve multiple objectives? And crucially, as you've sort of hinted at in your question, Jenny, what's the level of uncertainty associated with those different outcomes, and what's the level of kind of uncertainty tolerance that we can live with? That is becoming a very routine way of managing international tuna fisheries now, i.e. trying to break the cycle of just year on year negotiation decisions being made in that narrow kind of window, trying to incorporate risk factors to target species, particularly climate change, is something that the tuna RFMOs are really starting to gather pace on, but also broader, ecosystem and food web considerations. The Indian Ocean Tuna Commission has just commissioned 2 management strategy evaluations that are going to look at for skipjack tuna and swordfish, that are going to look at, what role does this species play in a food web, and how do we account for that in management. So I think those are really important opportunities. And I say this sort of to any stakeholder on this call. I think these are really good opportunities for us all to kind of collectively push for what is outlined in this checklist, which is, individual requests that can be formulated around stakeholder involvement and that can investigate lots of different scenarios, but without having to literally reformulate the entire system. And I think that tension between trying to do all things EBFM for all species and all stocks and all ecosystems at once versus trying to kind of tailor things for, particularly data-rich fisheries in ecosystems where other parts of the ecosystem are also quite well monitored and ecological relationships are understood, to sort of prioritize those situations and really try and be ambitious there, rather than trying to kind of step back, look at the entire framework and alter all reference points or all decision making framework. So yeah, that would be my take. MSCs as a kind of vehicle for the ecosystem approach on a more granular level than trying to look at an entire ecosystem.
Well, we are unfortunately approaching the hour, so then I would just like to ask you some final words on the importance of implementing EBFM, as we are moving into a month who is famously known for the amount of meeting of international fora like ICAT and EF and a
Absolutely.
lot more. So if you could share your final thoughts with us.
Yeah, happy to. I mean, I think the key message really is that this can be done. It doesn't have to all be done at once. That the relationship between scientific advisors and managers is a really, really critical one to move EBFM forward. And that you can use questions, you can use requests, you can use evaluations to be big picture, to be ambitious, to think of these trade-offs in advance and test them and plan for them. It doesn't mean committing to doing all things. It means kind of exploring possibilities and trying to subtly challenge some of the pre-existing conventions around how fisheries decisions are made.
Thank you, then. And thank you to all the speakers that have made this webinar series possible. And we hope this opened the door for a continued dialogue between science, civil society, and decision makers on EBFM as we move closer towards healthier and more resilient fisheries and biodiversity. To everyone present, thank you for joining us. It was a pleasure having you all here today. And if you have any remaining questions to ask, I believe our speakers have kindly shared their contacts, and we will circulate the recording of this webinar as well as the other webinars. So thanks everyone, and have a lovely weekend. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.